At the edge of shallow water, the Nile meets wet mud and a low bank where reeds rise from dark soil. Stones lie half buried in the ground, and thin water moves past roots and patches of marsh. These upper waters lie broadly in the lake region of East Africa and the Ethiopian highlands. But here, the river seems small. It stays close to the bank and damp earth, more like a local strip of water than the long course for which it is known. Yet this narrow edge is already part of a river system that will continue to the Mediterranean. The bank stays low, the reeds stand over the mud, and the first channels move on through the wet ground ahead. In the high country that feeds the upper Kagera system, water first shows itself in small ways. Damp soil darkens at the foot of cultivated slopes, and narrow runoff threads pass between grass and low plants before gathering along marshy edges where the ground stays soft underfoot. A shallow channel appears, then breaks, then appears again a little farther down, with trickles slipping past roots and small stones pressed into the bank. Hoof marks and footmarks hold water in the mud after rain. At the lower edge of a field, wet ground widens into seepage, then narrows again into a thin moving line. Nothing here looks like a great river. The first visible flow stays close to the ground, narrow enough to miss at a distance, but clear enough, once found, to be followed downhill through wet margins and worked land. The most practical beginning of the Nile lies in that small headwater country. The better-known outlet from Lake Victoria comes later in the chain of water. Farther upstream, the most remote headstream in the White Nile system is generally traced through the basin of the Kagera, whose upper feeders collect in these uplands before their waters continue into the lake and later emerge again as the Victoria Nile. So the beginning here is not a broad channel with a fixed name in common speech. It is water at ground level, moving out of high wet land into the first connected course that can still be followed downstream. As the flow continues, scattered seepage becomes a more regular channel. Short feeder streams descend from nearby folds in the land and join in valley bottoms where the soil remains saturated after rain. Reeded patches and wet grass still hold the banks in places, yet the water now keeps its line for longer stretches. Small cut banks begin to show where the current presses into softer ground. In slower turns, dark sediment settles among stems and roots, while clearer water passes over firmer earth below. From Rwanda and the uplands linked toward Burundi, these early flows descend by small gradients and repeated gatherings, each joining another thread until the drainage belongs more clearly to the Kagera system. The change is gradual. Marsh does not suddenly end, and the stream does not at once widen into a river. But the line holds longer, and what first appeared in fragments begins to read as one downstream course. This upper water setting is not empty terrain. The stream passes through inhabited highland country where slopes are cultivated, valley floors are used carefully, and wet ground directs ordinary movement. Paths keep to firmer edges before dropping to small crossings, sometimes no more than a narrow footbridge or a worn place in the bank. Fields stop short of the softest margins, where waterlogged soil and seasonal runoff make the ground unreliable. In some places, the channel marks the edge between worked plots. In others, it cuts below homes and trackways before turning through thicker growth at the bottom of the slope. Livestock come near the water, but not into every patch of mud, and the dampest strips remain visibly different from the drier land above them. Even here, before the Nile appears as a large presence, the water is already shaping where people step and where the ground can be used. By the end of this first headwater reach, the water no longer lies only as scattered wet ground and short broken threads. It begins to keep a recognizable course between banks that hold for more than a few meters at a time. The channel is still small, still close to grass, mud, and cultivated earth, but it now leads forward with less interruption, leaving behind the most diffuse source terrain. The eye no longer has to search from patch to patch to see where the flow continues. Ahead lies the first, more sustained stretch, where the water can be traced with greater certainty as river rather than source ground. Beside the first clear channel, the water now holds a line that the eye can follow. A narrow bank rises from damp ground, its edge marked by grass roots, darker soil, and small stones set into the side where runoff has cut through after rain. The stream bends around a low fold in the valley floor and continues beyond it without breaking into separate wet patches. On one side, cultivated ground comes down close to the water, before stopping at a softer strip of bank. On the other, taller grass and reedy growth lean over the margin where the soil stays wet longer than the slope above. The channel is still modest, not much wider than a person could cross in a few careful steps, but it now reads as a course rather than a series of hints. At this stage, the water belongs clearly to the Upper Kagera system. The channel remains narrow, with short banks, low overhanging growth, and bends that stay close to fields, paths, and valley-bottom grass. It does not resemble the broader river later associated with the Nile name. But the flow is no longer uncertain. It moves through the upland folds in a line that can be followed as a real upper course, small in scale but clear in direction. This is no longer source ground broken by seepage and marsh. It is a continuous channel holding its way forward. That continuity shows in the shape of the channel itself. The banks are firmer now, even when they remain low, and the current presses against outside bends strongly enough to leave small cut edges where fine soil gives way. In quieter sections, silt settles beneath grass stems and along inner curves, while in narrower reaches the water keeps a steadier movement over roots and compacted earth. Feeder water still enters, but now it arrives in visible joins. A side thread comes down from a wetter hollow and meets the main flow at an angle, adding water to a channel that holds together instead of thinning out into marsh. After rain, the stream marks its edges more sharply. In drier periods, the same banks remain visible even when the current runs lower. Because the course is now clear enough to divide land, it begins to shape ordinary use more plainly. Worked hillsides descend toward the valley, but cultivation often stops short of the dampest bottom strips, where the bank softens and the channel shifts enough to make close planting unreliable. Paths keep to firmer ground above the water, then drop towards simple crossings where the stream narrows or the banks rise enough to step down and back up again. In some places, a small footbridge or a few laid branches carry movement across. In others, repeated passage has worn a crossing point into the slope. The channel separates adjoining plots, bends around lower grazing ground, and gives nearby movement a line to follow. From here, the water no longer has to be found again at every turn. It can be followed as a small but definite course, moving away from the headwater country, holding together through bends, joins, and low valley turns from one reach to the next. The stream remains close to the ground and close to daily use, but it now presents itself as a river, in early form, modest in size, and steady enough to be known as one. Once a course can be followed like this, people begin to distinguish one reach from another and attach a beginning to particular banks, bends, and crossing points. The water goes on ahead as a real first course, and with it comes the next question: how such upper places are identified, regarded, and named. At Jinja, the water leaves Lake Victoria through a source setting that is broader than a single point, yet precise enough to be recognized on the ground. The outlet runs between small islands, presses past the channel edge, and gathers speed where the old Ripon Falls setting once broke the water into stronger movement. Near the marked source area, one island draws most visitors, while the other sits close by with large trees. Minor shrine remains, and a quieter claim on attention. The banks are low, and the water surface widens and narrows around the islands so that the eye is drawn toward the gap between them. There the current appears to well upward against the main surface flow, making the source feel fixed not only to the shore, but to a visible feature in the moving outlet itself. This place does not replace the earlier headstream beginning. It is the historically recognized White Nile source at Jinja, where the outlet itself was treated as a place of emergence. In Basoga understanding, this was where the Nile could be named at the lake's edge, and where a powerful water presence was encountered. The spirit associated with that source was Kiyira, understood in relation to water welling from below, and offerings were made at shrines on the nearby island facing the tourist side. Small wooden structures and sacrificial traces belonged to that practice. The source here was not the remotest upstream spring. It was the outlet current between the islands, approached as a living water place rather than as a neutral landmark. The source at Jinja was also part of a wider sacred stretch of river. Farther downstream, the falls at Bujagali and then Itanda were understood as places of their own, each tied to a distinct river power and to a broader ordering of spirits along that reach of the Nile. The source current belonged within that order rather than standing apart from it. Rapids, falls, and strong water were not treated as interchangeable scenery. Attention stayed with exact features, The outlet between the islands, the former falls setting near Ginger, the heavier rapids below, and the next waterfall farther on, where the water struck harder, sounded louder, or broke more sharply. Force was read more plainly in the river itself. That understanding shaped how people approached the water. Shrines stood near the source. Offerings were made in relation to requests and vows, and ritual specialists acted as intermediaries between human need and river power. Visits were not only acts of observation, people came seeking help with health, children, prosperity, protection, or relief from misfortune, and sacrifices followed when promised results were believed to have been granted. These offerings were not limited to a single annual calendar. They could follow a particular request, a fulfilled obligation, or a return visit after a healer had been consulted. Later, these practices existed beside Christianity, rather than disappearing into a single replacement system. At Ginger, some approached the river in church language, others through older Basoga ritual, and many through a lived setting in which both stood close to the same water. Set beside those beliefs, the source remains a physical place first. Water presses through the outlet, the islands divide the surface, and the current marks one narrow zone as different from the surrounding lake water. The channel edge, the nearby ground, and the old fall's setting keep the source from dissolving into a general idea. Sacred interpretation stayed tied to visible features, a confined passage, a counter-moving flow, shrine traces on one island, and stronger broken water farther downstream. The outlet continues past the islands and into the first Upper Nile reach, leading directly into a closer look at the landform, waterscape, and river structure that hold this historically recognized beginning on the ground. Just beyond the lake outlet, the young river is pressed into a firmer shape. Water that had spread more broadly at the source now gathers into a narrower course, moving past rock at the channel edge and through a reach where the surface begins to fall more decisively. The banks no longer look soft and open in every direction. They show cut faces, short ledges, and darker strips of damp soil above the line of stronger flow. In places, the current strikes stone and turns abruptly, then runs on between tighter margins that hold it in place. The river is still young in scale, but it is no longer simply leaving the lake. It has entered a corridor where slope and harder ground begin to set its form. That form is directed by terrain far older than the river's present appearance. Here, the White Nile headwaters lie in a landscape shaped by ancient Precambrian crystalline rock, long weathering, and later tectonic change between the eastern and western arms of the East African rift system. This is not a broad alluvial flat. It is a plateau and rift setting, in which the reaches between lake basins are steeper, broken by rapids and falls, and youthful in appearance. In this early stretch, the Victoria Nile tends to narrow, drop, and run against bedrock control rather than spread at once into a wide sediment-built valley. The channel is young, but the ground beneath it is very old, and that old ground still governs the first shape the water can take. Beside that firmer structure lies softer material that the river is already working on. Weathered soils formed on old crystalline ground sit along the slopes and margins, often red or yellow where long leaching has altered the rock, and darker where moisture lingers in lower ground. When flow strengthens, loose soil is stripped from exposed edges and carried into the current, leaving small scars in the bank and muddying the water below disturbed patches. Where the river slackens along an inside bend or a wet edge, finer sediment settles again. The result is a repeated exchange between hard and soft ground. Rock confines the course, softer soil yields to it, and the river sorts what it takes, carrying some material on while letting some of it fall out along quieter margins. Those conditions affect nearby land use in practical ways. Cultivated slopes can lose soil where runoff reaches the river margin and where the bank has already been weakened by cutting water. Fine earth washed from worked ground moves downslope into wetter strips below, where it may settle in low patches or thicken the mud at the edge. Because of that, firmer or slightly raised ground beside the river is often the safer place for paths, planting, and repeated passage, while softer, lower margins remain less reliable after rain or stronger flow. The pattern is modest, but easy to read. A river guided by rock can still wear away soft banks, and a slope built on old weathered soil can still feed loose material into the water when the ground is exposed or disturbed. So this early course is both fixed and changing at once. Its basic line is set by rock, relief, and the confined structure of the plateau reach, which keep the young Victoria Nile narrow, falling, and more strongly guided than a river on a broad plain. Yet within that frame, the water keeps revising its margins. A stronger season can bite farther into soft ground, lift more suspended material, and leave fresh deposits where the current eases again. A lower season can expose more stone, narrow the active thread, and make recent bankwear easier to read. The old ground remains, and the river keeps working on it. The next change begins there, not in new geology, but in rain, runoff, and the seasonal pulse that alters how this upper river moves through the ground that contains it. At the edge of the upper river, the season first shows itself in small changes of level and ground. After the rains, water stands higher against grass roots and low stems. Fresh mud spreads over the bank, and soft patches widen where a path had recently been firm. The margin darkens, cut marks in the soil look newer, and thin-side hollows hold water longer than before. In drier intervals, the edge draws back a little. More stone appears at the foot of the bank. Exposed soil dries and lightens, and the ground beside the channel becomes easier to cross without sinking. The course does not vanish, and the bank does not lose its form. What changes is the line between water and land, advancing and retreating enough to be read by anyone standing beside it. That pattern is driven chiefly by rainfall over the lake basin and the adjacent land, not by snowmelt or by a single dramatic flood season. In the Lake Victoria region, the year is broadly divided by two wetter periods, one around March to May and another later in the year, especially around October to December, with relatively drier intervals between them. Rain falling directly on the lake matters, and so does runoff from the surrounding basin. Heat also plays its part. Water is continually lost again through evaporation, affecting the level of the lake and the condition of the river margins below the outlet. The result is a repeating annual adjustment rather than an abrupt transformation. In this zone, the young White Nile responds to rain, warmth, and water loss in ways that alter banks and low ground, without turning the channel into something unrecognizable from one season to the next. The lakes keep that response more moderate than it would be in a small upland stream. Lake Victoria stores rainfall over a wide surface, and the linked White Nile system through Lakes Kyoga and Albert adds further storage and delay, so the outflow is buffered rather than released all at once. Hydrological work on the White Nile describes this as a connected lake-river system, in which storage and attenuation shape how water moves onward. Seasonal change still shows itself in softer low margins, wetter grass strips, and small expansions into side hollows, but the river remains comparatively even. Its upper course rises and falls within banks that stay legible, and the yearly rhythm appears less as sudden force than as repeated adjustment in edge, saturation, and current. Those changes are practical for anyone living beside the water. In the wetter seasons, low ground near the bank becomes softer, tracks are more easily cut into mud, and the easiest line of foot passage may shift a little upslope onto firmer ground. In drier periods, the river edge becomes more reliable for crossing short stretches, reaching the water, or moving along the bank without stepping into pooled hollows. Slightly raised ground near the river would have offered an obvious advantage, close enough to dependable water, but above the patches most likely to stay saturated after rain. The same applies to worked land. A margin that is too low remains wetter and less certain, while a modest rise beside it is easier to use repeatedly across the year. This is not a riverbank fixed in one condition. It is a riverbank regular enough to be used, but variable enough to demand attention. So the upper Nile, in this early zone, settles into a pattern that can be observed and remembered. Water rises at certain times. Low edges soften. Fresh mud appears, and then the bank firms again as the level eases back. The lakes prevent the sharpest swings, but they do not erase the annual pulse. They turn it into something steadier. A river whose edge changes by season while its course remains readable. That regularity comes before large settlements or formal river works. It allows the ground beside the channel to be approached as a place of repeated use. From here, the next step is close at hand, because a bank that changes in recognizable ways is a bank where people can return, settle nearby, and begin to use the river's edge again and again. At the northern end of Lake Albert, The gathered water no longer looks like a narrow upper reach feeling its way between close banks. The surface is wider now, with more distance between one shore and the other, and the edge of the lake-river transition is softened by swampy ground, reeds, and wet approaches that hold water beyond the main line of flow. Near the outlet, the water appears slower and heavier than it did in the rock-guided reaches above. Mud lies deeper at the margin, channels through the fringe are less direct, and the bank is harder to approach in a straight line. The river that leaves here does not begin as a sharp thread cut cleanly into one bank. It emerges from fuller stored water, from a body that has already widened and steadied what entered it from farther south. That increase in scale has been assembled in stages. By the time the water gathers at the northern end of Lake Albert, the Victoria Nile has already crossed the broad middle country, passed through Lake Kyoga, and entered another large basin, so the flow has been slowed, stored, and carried onward through linked waters rather than through one uninterrupted channel. Water is collected, delayed, and regulated by the chain of lakes before it continues north. The river therefore feels more established in this zone. Its breadth does not come from one sudden meeting alone, but from repeated passage through lakes and wetlands that soften sharp changes and hold more water in the system before releasing it again. One named addition makes that process visible in a clear way. The Semliki enters Lake Albert from the south after draining Lake Edward and the wet mountain country around the Rwenzori region and adjacent western high ground. In its lower course, it spreads into delta wetlands, carries silt, and adds a substantial secondary body of water to the lake before the northward outlet begins. Smaller rivers and wetland inflows also feed Lake Albert, but the Semliki shows most clearly how joined water increases both volume and staying power. It arrives not as a single dramatic open river confluence, but through the wider receiving space of the lake, where added inflow is absorbed, stored, and then passed on into a steadier outflow at the northern end. At the edges, that broader upper river changes how the ground can be used. A narrow crossing becomes less likely where the margin is wet, reed-fringed, and uncertain underfoot, and the approach to the water often has to follow firmer points or established landing places rather than any convenient straight path. The wider, steadier water also favours repeated use along certain banks, especially where fishing edges, canoe access, or slightly raised ground offer a practical hold above the marshier strips. The same swampy fringe that makes crossing more awkward also creates sheltered margins and a shoreline where regular use depends on knowing which edges remain sound and which soften into mud and shallow flooded growth. When the water finally leaves Lake Albert, it does so with a different character from the earlier source region river. It is still part of the Upper Nile world, but it now has more width, more continuity, and a steadier presence than the young courses farther upstream. At the north end of the lake, the outlet gathers itself into a true onward channel, no longer mainly a first course proving its continuity, and no longer simply a lake-fed passage between separate reaches, but the Albert Nile beginning to move away as a fuller stream. From here, the river is harder to mistake, a broader corridor of water already enlarged by what it has received. In the sidewater beside the Bahr al-Jabal, the ground is too soft to trust for long. A narrow passage slips between reeds and floating vegetation, then widens without warning into shallow water where the bank is no longer one firm edge, but a broken meeting of mud, stems, pooled water, and half-flooded ground. What looks solid from a short distance gives way underfoot. A line of darker water passes ahead through the plants, but beside it lie still patches, small openings, and soaked margins that seem neither fully land nor fully channel. Here the river is first met not as a single current with clear banks, but as a wet zone entered from within, where even a short change in direction can lead from firmer margin into floating growth and shallow flooded ground. That change comes as the Bahr al-Jabal leaves the more confined upper course and enters flatter country. From Juba toward Bor, the river still meanders through a trough, but below Bor it spreads into meandering reaches, side channels, lagoons, and floodplain water that receives overflow when the banks are overtopped. The main flow remains present, yet it is accompanied by marsh belts, shallow basins, and side water that stay tied to the river even when they appear separate at ground level. In this setting, the Nile is no longer best read as one banked line alone. The Sud begins here as part of the river's own structure on flat land, where open channel and wet margin belong to the same continuous water system. Once water enters that marsh world, it no longer moves forward at one shared pace. The central channel may continue, but water spilling into permanent swamps, seasonal basins, and flooded side ground is held back, spread out, and slowed by the wetland itself. Some of it lingers in shallow storage near the main course. Some remains over seasonally flooded ground, and some gathers again in narrower passages only after time has passed. Hydrological studies of the Sud describe a vast, interconnected wetland in which large volumes of White Nile flow spread beyond the margins, while the wetland as a whole regulates and retains that water across a wider mosaic of channels and inundated ground. At bank level, the effect is plain enough. Current, delay, and spread now sit beside one another in the same river reach. Life near such water depends on knowing where the firmer edges are. Permanent settlement has favoured higher ground above the floodplain, while seasonal movement and small-scale cultivation use intermediate or slightly raised land when conditions allow. In the rains and flood periods, low approaches soften and open water routes become more useful than direct passage across wet ground. In drier phases, certain banks, landing places, and channels become easier to use again, though the wetland never turns into simple dry land. Even movement through the Sud depends on following usable passages between papyrus, reeds, lagoons, and seasonally flooded margins. Here, travel is guided less by one visible bank than by remembered routes, known landings, and patches of ground that remain dependable longer than the rest. So the Nile leaves this stretch as more than a central current. It has become a broader wet corridor in which open channel, reed margin, floodplain water, and soft side basins all belong to the same river world. The main flow is still there, but its usable edges now matter more than any single bank line. Anyone moving through this country would need to know where the water narrows, where the ground rises slightly, and where the wetland gives passage instead of resistance. That is the form the river takes here. Not one hard line on the ground, but a corridor of water and saturated land whose firmer margins begin to draw repeated human use, setting up the next closer look at the people who learned how to live beside it. On slightly raised ground above the wet margin, the village begins where the floodplain stops being reliable underfoot. Huts and fenced compounds stand back from the soft, lower soil, not far from the water, but high enough to remain usable when the marsh edge widens in the wet season. A footpath runs down the slope toward a landing place, where canoes can be pulled close to the bank or tied among reeds at a firmer notch in the edge. Beyond the houses, grazing land opens on drier patches that hold longer than the ground below. From the settlement, the river can still be reached in a short walk, yet the village itself does not sit inside the most unstable zone. Below lie mud, shallow standing water, and flood-marked grass. Above lies soil dry enough for repeated building, storage, and return. Permanent settlement in this upper wetland world gathers on higher ground around the floodplain rather than along the nearest water at any point. In the Sud region, the lower margins are too exposed to seasonal flooding, shifting channels, and prolonged saturation to support stable year-round occupation everywhere. Slightly raised land offers a workable position. It keeps people close to dependable water, fishing grounds, and grazing access, while avoiding the deepest inundation of the lower wet zone. A village in such a place does not turn away from the river. It holds beside it on ground where walls can stand, paths can stay open, and the same site can be used again across changing conditions. The settlement edge remains near the floodplain, close enough for daily movement and seasonal return, but set on firmer land. That permanent village is only one part of a wider pattern of use. In the dry season, movement extends outward from the higher settlement into intermediate lands known as Toich, the seasonally flooded grazing country between permanent village ground and the deeper wetland. When the waters fall back, these lands open for cattle, temporary camps, and work tied to grass, water access, and the renewed use of exposed floodplain margins. When the wet season returns, that lower country becomes less dependable again, and people draw back toward the more secure, higher ground. The village therefore acts as an anchor rather than a complete enclosure of life. It holds the more durable structures and the permanent social centre, while the surrounding riverland is used in stages according to water level, pasture, and access. Settlement and floodplain belong to one seasonal system, but they are not occupied in the same way all year. Daily life at the edge of such a village reflects that placement. Fishing is an obvious support where river channels, backwaters, and wetland margins remain close at hand, and it can matter both in the dry season and when higher water spreads into accessible side channels. Canoes, nets, and familiar landing spots link the settlement to the wider water, even when the main bank shifts or softens. On the firmer ground above, small-scale cultivation becomes possible during the wet season, when the soil holds enough moisture for growth but is still solid enough to work. The two uses fit the site. Water provides fish and access to lower seasonal lands, while the raised ground supports gardens, storage, and the steadier parts of household life. A village too low would sit inside the wettest floodplain. A village too far from the river would lose the dependable resources that make settlement here workable. Seen from the edge of the village, the logic of the place is exact. Below the houses lies the wetter margin, with its reeds, landing points, and changing floodplain ground. Above and around them lies drier soil that can bear repeated use. Between those two conditions, the settlement holds a chosen position, close enough to the river to depend on it, high enough to endure its seasonal changes. That balance gives the village its form and keeps people returning to the same sites beside the water. Paths descend to the bank. Cattle move toward lower grazing in the right season. Fishing places acquire familiar approaches, and the edge between wet ground and habitable ground grows clearer through use. From here, the river corridor is no longer only a wet landscape with occasional firm patches. It is becoming an inhabited margin, shaped by repeated movement, known access points, and settled ground beside the floodplain. On a low rise beside seasonally flooded grassland, the ground tells a different story from the wet margin below it. The lower edge is soft, marked by floodwater, dark mud, and grasses that hold moisture long after standing water has gone. Above that lies a firmer patch, where people could return without sinking into the same wet ground. Such places are not dramatic, but they are useful. A slight height above the Toich gives dry footing, a clear view across lower land, and short access to water, grazing, and the seasonal edge where animals and people both move. Over time, repeated occupation could alter the rise itself, leaving a mound no longer entirely natural, but built up through ash, trampling, and the remains of many returns. This upper Nile corridor was already being used long before later villages and towns become easier to trace in the record. In the wider zone, Locabulo rock shelter in eastern Equatoria preserves evidence of pre-ceramic late Stone Age hunter-gatherer occupation before 3000 BC, and pottery appears there at about 2000 BC, as part of a wider ceramic presence in eastern Equatoria. Farther west, the mound sites east of Rumbek show another form of repeated use. Set on or near the ecotone, where seasonally flooded grassland meets savanna woodland. Taken together, rock shelters with lithic scatters and occupation rises beside wet grassland, point to a river region already marked by stopping points, return places, and older paths through usable ground. Over time, the pattern of use changed, but the landscape did not cease to be worked. Earlier shelter use and stone tool scatters point to hunter-gatherer movement through river-adjacent country. Later layers in eastern Equatoria and the upper Nile basin show communities combining newer practices with older ones. Cattle keeping of considerable antiquity in the region, alongside hunting and fishing, and in some areas, probably limited cultivation as well. At Jebel Touki, ceramic-using late Stone Age hunters and cattle herders appear from the 1st millennium BC into the 1st millennium AD. More broadly, the archaeological picture for South Sudan shows mixed livelihoods of herding, hunting, and fishing, with some cultivation likely in later phases. The continuity lies not in one fixed way of life, but in continued human use of the same river-edge world under changing subsistence. That long use left practical marks on the landscape. People repeatedly chose ecotones, where firmer woodland or plateau ground met seasonally flooded grassland, because those edges allowed access to several kinds of resource, without requiring full occupation of the wettest land. East of Rumbek, many cattle campsites were used again year after year. and some became ash mounds rising above the surrounding Teuch. The mounds stood clear of floodwater and remained visible across otherwise low country. Their position reflects ordinary needs rather than monumental intent. Access to wet season and dry season grazing, short movement to water, space for camp activity and stock keeping, and the repeated burning and accumulation that gradually altered the surface. These were not yet formal river towns. They were durable human footholds in a seasonally shifting corridor. So by the time later villages appear more clearly beside the upper Nile, they enter a landscape that was already known. Selected rises, shelter points, mound sites, and seasonal edges had been used for a very long time before more stable settlement patterns become easier to follow. Paths toward wet grassland, returns to the same occupation patches, and repeated use of ground above the flood level all belong to an older human geography already in place. The river corridor ahead will show clearer banks, routes, crossings, and more durable settlement traces, but those later forms do not begin in emptiness. They follow a landscape already shaped by older movement, older camps, and long familiarity with the chosen edges between water, grassland, and firmer ground. At the foot of the higher settlement ground, the route begins at the bank. A worn path descends from the huts above to a firmer strip of landing ground where a light canoe can be pulled half out of the water and tied against roots or short posts. Wet soil spreads away on either side, and the easier approach is confined to one place where the bank holds together under repeated use. Below the path, footprints and dragged stems mark the edge between village ground and channel. A person coming down from the settlement meets the river here by hand, at a known landing place where the bank can be reached without stepping into reed-filled mud, and where departure depends on one sound line from dry ground into water. In this country, water travel is often more reliable than movement over land. The Bahr el Jebel stretch from Malakal toward Juba is navigable, though low water and seasonal conditions affect some sections, and recent basin navigation work treats the reach in two parts with Bahr as a cross point. More broadly across South Sudan, inland water transport has long mattered most when roads are weakened by rain, flood, and wetland ground. Even where overland passage remains possible, it is seldom direct. Floodplain, marsh, and the lack of firm all-weather roads push movement back toward the channel. The river offers a continuous line through ground that is often softened, broken, or cut off for much of the year. That route depends on craft and on local knowledge. In the upper Nile and Sud zone, dugout canoes were used for fishing and transport in swamp and marsh country, where shallow water and narrow passages favoured light craft that could be poled, paddled, or drawn close to difficult banks. Farther north, along the White Nile corridor, movement could be organised on a larger scale. The Shilluk were concentrated in the riverine strip along the White Nile, and for centuries dominated long reaches of the river through canoe power. Their settlements stretched along the bank, and their control of the channel depended on waterborne movement that could strike, transport, and connect from one riverside point to another. The route existed only where people knew the open channels, knew the banks, and had boats suited to the water they were using. Once the river is used in this way, the bank becomes a working edge. Some landing places matter more than others because they offer firmer footing, a safer approach, or greater control over who comes and goes. The historical record of Shilluk dominance along the river suggests that travellers and caravans would have preferred known banks where passage was protected rather than exposed. At controlled points farther north, a market could gather at a river place such as Kaka, which became a White Nile market town under that wider regime of river control. In the wetland stretches, channels served local exchange in a smaller form. Fishing routes, canoe transport, and access to reachable banks where goods, people, and news could move between firmer settlement ground and the water world beyond it. The route was not only a line of travel, it was also a line of meeting, exchange, and guarded access at selected banks. By this point in the upper corridor, the river is no longer simply beside human life. It runs through it as a repeated route with known landings, known channels, and known crossing places. The canoe at the bank, the seasonal barge passage on deeper stretches, the cross point at Bore, and the controlled riverside settlements farther north all belong to the same change in use. Water still provides fish, grazing access, and settlement support. But it is also a line of movement that people return to because they know where it can be entered and where it can be followed. Repeated passage gives some banks more weight than others. A landing place becomes habitual, a crossing becomes expected, and a river edge used again and again begins to take on the first, more fixed points of control that the next chapter can follow more closely. At a strong point on the White Nile, authority begins with position. The bank stands a little higher here, firm enough for boats to be drawn below it, and steep enough for anyone approaching from the water to be seen before reaching the top. A path comes down from the settlement above to one controlled landing place, not to an open shore. Canoes lie at the edge of the current. Men can watch both the bank and the channel, and movement through the water narrows into something that can be observed, allowed, delayed, or refused. In this corridor, power does not need stone walls to appear. A raised bank, a guarded approach, and a settlement placed where traffic can be watched are enough to turn a stretch of river into a point of command. That kind of control gathered most clearly at royal centres such as Fashoda. The Shilluk kingdom was concentrated along the riverine strip of the White Nile, and Fashoda served as the chief town and royal residence from which authority could be fixed beside the channel rather than dispersed across open country. This was not power detached from the water. It was power held in river form. The Shilluk dominated long reaches of the White Nile from the mid-17th century until the 1860s, and that dominance rested on canoes, on settlements strung along the bank, and on the ability to intervene wherever the river could be reached. A permanent capital on the bank turned a moving corridor into ruled territory. The river did not simply pass the capital, it fed it, linked it, and placed the kingdom directly beside the line it controlled. Later, a harder form of control appeared in the fortified river posts of the 19th century. As the southern White Nile was opened more aggressively to outside trade and official intervention, zarabas were established, fortified camps and enclosed trading posts set up by traders, slavers, and government agents at strategic points. These were not great masonry fortresses. They were stockaded or defended settlements, tied to the river, built to hold men, goods, and coercive force at places where passage and exchange could be intercepted. The channel itself became part of that arrangement. A clear example came in 1855, when a control post was established at Fashoda so that slave-laden boats could be stopped there as they moved along the river. Here, the water was not just the setting for authority. Boats, current, and controlled bank met in one enforceable line. Once a few river points were held this way, the surrounding banks changed in practice. Travellers and traders no longer met an evenly accessible shoreline. They encountered known places where landing was safer, where passage could be protected, and where local authority or outside agents might demand compliance before movement could continue. Boats might be halted below a watched bank, questioned at a post, or directed toward one recognized landing place instead of another. People living near the river had to reckon with those concentrated access points, because a controlled bank could draw exchange toward itself and pull movement away from less protected reaches. The effect was practical and local. Traffic gathered where it could be managed, and communities near the channel found that river power was no longer spread loosely through settlement alone, but fixed at a smaller number of banks, capitals, and enclosed posts. By this stage, the White Nile in this upper corridor functions as more than a route. It has become a line of command marked by particular banks and by places whose importance comes from repeated control of passage. A capital such as Fashoda gives the river a political centre. Shilluk canoe power gives it reach. Zaribas and control posts give it harder edges, where the bank itself can be used to stop, divert, and dominate movement on the water. None of this requires the river to be lined with castles. The stronger reality is more exact. Raised banks, guarded landings, royal settlements, and fortified posts at points where the channel can be mastered. From here, it is only a short step to more regular crossings, more fixed stations, and the kinds of repeated river works that grow wherever movement is controlled, often enough to leave lasting marks on the bank. At a worked crossing place, the bank has already been cut into use. A sloped approach runs down from firmer ground to the water, where a ferry or shallow barge is held against the edge, while sacks, crates, and loose cargo are lowered by hand. The wet margin below is too soft for waiting, so people gather a little higher up where the ground will hold carts, animals, or a queue of travellers. Close to the water, the riverbank is not ornamental. It is shaped just enough to solve a recurring problem. How to reach the channel without slipping into mud, how to steady a vessel against the current, and how to move goods between land and boat on a river that rarely offers a ready-made quay. That practical logic defines this corridor. The Malakal, Juba stretch was described in the Nile Basin Initiative navigation baseline as navigable but low and seasonal, organized around a very small number of usable nodes rather than a dense network of fixed crossings. One bridge, 10 ports, and bore serving as a cross point between the lower and upper sections of the reach. That is how the upper White Nile works. Movement is organized through a few banks that can be used repeatedly, while much of the river remains difficult, shallow, marsh-fringed, or unreliable at low water. A crossing is seldom available everywhere. It depends on selected places where the bank can be reached. The depth is sufficient, and the approach from land is not cut off by wet ground, because the river itself is awkward. Small works matter. The navigation record for this stretch notes low dry season levels, exposed rocks around Juba, silting, and limited port infrastructure, while more recent project documents for the Juba bore section describe slipways, port access roads, dredging or channel clearing, shallow areas, shipwrecks, floating vegetation, and bank protection as necessary parts of keeping the water usable. At many ports, cargo has long been loaded and unloaded by hand, and even Juba has been described as having only limited facilities. So the river edge is improved in pieces. A jetty where one can be built, a slipway where vessels can be handled, an access road where trucks can approach, and clearance where shoals, wrecks, debris, or vegetation obstruct passage. None of these works is large on its own, but each makes one stretch of bank more dependable than the next. Those few works can change movement far beyond their immediate bank. In Juba, the older Nile bridge had deteriorated to the point where repairs forced one-way traffic, disrupting logistics across the city and along the wider transport corridor. When Freedom Bridge was completed, official accounts noted that it shortened the time needed to cross the Nile and allowed large vehicles to pass safely. The effect was not limited to road traffic. It changed how the riverbank worked as a hinge between water and land, concentrating more predictable movement at a fixed bridgehead, while ports and river access roads continued to tie the water route into a country where road travel is often poor or seasonal. A bridge here does not replace the working bank. It makes one bank more decisive than the marshier reaches beside it. By now, certain stretches of the upper White Nile begin to feel more settled in function even if the river itself remains difficult. Cargo is brought to known ramps, barges are handled at known ports, crossings gather at known bridgeheads, and the navigable line is maintained where possible through repeated clearance and repair. The bank is still shaped by mud, low water, and seasonal obstruction, but it is no longer approached as a vague edge. It is approached through habit, a worked slope, a docking point, a ferry place, or a maintained channel gives one patch of riverbank a more fixed role than the wet margins behind it. From here, it is easy to move into larger centres along the Nile, because repeated crossing and repeated handling of goods have already begun to sort the river into more durable places of arrival, departure, and control. At one usable landing, the Nile bank has already been worn into shape by repeated work. A boat lies against a short timber edge and a section of packed earth where many feet have pressed the slope firm enough for loading. Men step from hull to bank with bent backs and careful footing, lifting sacks, baskets, and tied bundles clear of the wet margin before setting them higher up where the ground will hold. Near the waterline, mud shows heel marks, drag lines, and the cuts made by poles pushed down for balance. The edge is too narrow for weighting, so those who are not carrying stand a little above the slope and leave the working strip free. Above it, the bank is drier and more dependable, and loads are set there in small groups rather than in one heap. Another boat waits a little off the edge, turning in the current until space is cleared and the first load has been carried up. Here, the river meets the land at arm's length and under direct handling, close enough for each movement to be watched. Grain comes up in sacks darkened by spray at the lower corners. Fish arrive in baskets that must be lifted quickly before sun and air begin to change them. A few poles or cut lengths of timber are slid ashore and left parallel to the path, so they do not roll back toward the water. Pottery is carried more carefully, passed from hand to hand, and set apart from rougher goods. Some loads stay only long enough to be counted and shifted to another carrier. Others wait under cover until a buyer, a carrier, or a family group is ready to move them on. No broad square is needed here. The landing itself is enough, with boats stopping at the edge, goods sorted on the bank, and nearby tracks leading inland toward huts, store pits, fenced yards, or a settlement edge just beyond the flood mark. Work spreads outward from the landing in practical forms. A damaged hull is tipped slightly and checked along the seams where water has worked the joins loose. Rope is twisted, dried, or retied, where it can be reached quickly when another boat comes in. Poles are trimmed smooth at one end and stacked together for pushing through shallower reaches. Baskets are patched close to the bank because they must return to use almost at once. Nearby, clay vessels may stand in a rough line after filling or sealing, and fish can be cleaned, split, or laid out for drying where transport and water are both close at hand. A man shaving wood from a replacement peg, another pressing fibre tight into a rope splice, and a woman packing goods more securely into woven containers all work within the same narrow shore. There is no separate workshop district set back from the water. The craft stays at the landing, growing out of repeated handling, repair, packing, and preparation at the few places where boats regularly touch land and goods regularly change hands along the bank. Over time, the bank shows less of an open shoreline and more of a worked edge. The slope between water and dry ground becomes firmer under constant use, while the softer margins are avoided and left rough. A main path hardens above the landing where bare feet, sandals, and loads have passed often enough to hold a line. Slight shelters of reed, matting, or timber gather above flood reach, giving shade to goods and workers, and marking off a space where sorting can continue when the waterline is busy. Broken pottery, trimmed fibre, fish scales, wood chips, and worn rope ends collect in the margins of work rather than in the landing strip itself. Children may appear at the upper edge of the path. Animals wait where the ground is less crowded, and people heading inland learn to move around the fixed strip where loading is done. The shore remains simple, but it no longer looks accidental. It has been handled into function, narrowed by repeated use, and tied more firmly to the settlement ground above it. By the end of the day, the movements become smaller and more regular. One boat pushes off with its stern eased clear by a pole, while another sits half unloaded beside the worn edge. Repaired gear is stacked above the bank. Baskets rest upside down to dry, and a few loads remain in place for the next crossing or the next downstream departure. The marks of labour stay visible after the people thin out. A hardened path, a cut slope, a working strip between water and firmer earth, and small stores of materials ready for use again at first light. At places like this, the Nile bank is no longer only a natural margin. It is becoming a managed frontage, where repeated river work settles into more fixed arrangements and prepares the way for stretches of shore that will look less like a landing place and more like an organized riverfront with storage, oversight, and daily movement gathering into a denser edge of life. At one worked stretch, firm ground begins only a few steps above the river margin. The lower bank is dark with damp soil, but just beyond it the surface rises enough to hold a narrow strip of usable earth. Cut grass lies there in uneven rows, turned so the wetter underside can dry. A path, pressed flat by repeated passing, leads from the bank toward a small run of fields where the soil has been opened and worked without losing its moisture. Near the edge, reeds and rougher growth give way to shorter stems, trampled patches, and places where tools have cut close to the ground. The water is near enough to shape everything underfoot. It does not cover this strip now, but its recent reach still shows in the darker earth, the softer footing at the lower edge, and the line where more dependable ground begins. Land like this is used in direct relation to the river's level. When the water draws back, it leaves a margin that can be worked before the ground dries too far or hardens. On slightly higher strips, people plant into soil that still holds moisture below the surface. Lower sections that stay softer for longer are used differently. Cattle or goats are brought onto them while the growth is fresh, or grass is cut there and carried up to dry where the air moves more freely. Some ground is worked only for a short part of the year, then left when the bank becomes too wet again, or when the channel rises close enough to narrow the strip. In places where the river has dropped only recently, the soil can still be marked by a heel or tool blade with very little pressure. Everything depends on small changes in level, on how long water has stood, and on whether the ground can be entered, cut, planted, or grazed without losing footing. The line between wet and workable land decides the labour that follows. Small acts of water management make that edge more dependable. A shallow cut leads away from the bank into a low patch, carrying enough water to darken the soil, but not enough to break it down. Elsewhere, a man lifts water by hand in a suspended container and tips it into a furrow that guides it a little farther across the surface. After enough use, these channels hold their shape as lightly as footprints become paths. Mud is pressed up along one side to keep water from spreading too widely, and a narrow outlet is opened where the ground needs to drain rather than hold. The boundary between one work strip and the next may be no more than a raised lip of earth, a change in stubble, or a worn crossing point. Nothing here resembles a broad plan laid across the floodplain. It is local adjustment, repeated season after season, by people watching how far water should be invited and where it must be stopped. The bank above the worked strip begins to serve more than one purpose at once. A landing place nearby allows bundles of cut grass or tied sheaves to be shifted toward a boat as easily as toward a yard inland. The path between field and bank hardens where loads are dragged or carried, and it widens at points where people set things down before moving them again. Fodder is stacked above the damp ground in low heaps that keep clear of seepage, while tools are left where they can be reached without being taken back to the settlement after every task. Animals waiting for pasture stand off the main path on firmer patches where the bank will bear their weight. In a place used often enough, transport and cultivation begin to share the same few surfaces. The shore is no longer only a place of loading or crossing. It also becomes the working face of nearby land, bringing boat movement, cut vegetation, stored feed, and short carrying into the same narrow belt beside the water. At the edge of evening work, the signs remain plain. Cut stems show pale where they have been taken close to the margin. Damp footprints mark the path between bank and field, deeper at the lower end where the soil still yields. A hoe, a coil of rope, and 2 bundles of grass rest above the reach of the wettest ground, ready to be taken farther up or loaded later. Beyond them, another stretch of bank shows the same arrangement in slightly firmer form: a managed edge, a path, a worked strip, and ground already tied more closely to regular use. Here, The Nile does not pass a separate farming world set back from the water. Productive land begins beside the bank itself, and with each repeated season that worked margin supports denser use, firmer boundaries, and the kind of riverside order that can sustain larger households, more organised holdings, and settlements set more securely into the line of the river. At one altered reach, the Nile no longer meets the bank in an irregular line. The edge has been cut back and held with packed earth and a facing of stone where the water would otherwise eat into softer ground. Beside the main flow, a side canal opens at a measured angle, taking part of the current into a narrower channel whose level can be checked at a gate set between heavy posts. Water gathers briefly at the threshold, then passes through in a controlled sheet, lower on one side than the other. A path runs beside the cut, worn by feet, tools and animals hauling loads. The earth near the gate is hard underfoot from repeated maintenance, and the bank face shows places where it has been patched rather than left to break away. Nothing here suggests a margin left to settle where it will. The slope has been trimmed, the edge fixed, and the water enters its side course under visible restraint. From the bank, the change can be read in the movement of the water itself. Where the open river spreads against mud, reeds, or a broken edge, this managed section holds to a firmer line. The canal draws off part of the flow before it can wander across a softer margin, and the bank beside it stands straighter because it is kept against cutting and collapse. Sediment is cleared where it would narrow the passage. Brush is cut back from the path and from the channel mouth, so the entrance stays open. In stretches where boats once had to approach uncertain ground or wait on awkward shallows, directed water offers a more regular edge, whether for lifting water inland, passing small craft through a steadier reach, or keeping a working channel from spreading into unusable wet ground. The difference lies in surfaces and movement, a cleaner line of flow, a bank that holds its shape, and a current sent where it is meant to go. One attached use stands a little below the gate, where a mill race takes water under control rather than by chance. The side current narrows again between built edges and strikes the wheel with more force than the open river would give at this bank. Close by, men watch the gateboards and adjust them when the level shifts too far, raising one side or lowering another, so the flow remains strong without becoming destructive. Sacks wait under cover, and ground grain is carried out before spray can reach it. The mill does not stand apart from the channel work. It depends on it at each point where water is admitted, checked, and released. Without the cut entrance, the held bank, and the measured drop in level, the wheel would turn too weakly in one season and too hard in another. Here, the river has been divided, narrowed, and released in a form that can be used day after day. Such a place changes the surrounding bank as surely as it changes the current. Paths gather near the gate and mill because workers, carriers, and those waiting for passage all have reason to stop at the same point. Small store areas appear above the wettest ground, close enough for handling but high enough to keep clear of seepage and splashing flow. Timber, replacement boards, ropes, and tools lie in ordered stacks where repairs can be made quickly. A boat held at the managed edge can be loaded or delayed with less uncertainty than at an open muddy landing, and that shifts movement toward the controlled point. Nearby, an older landing of softer mud and broken reeds is used less often because the managed edge offers firmer footing and more predictable depth. The river here is no longer approached as a broad margin where one searches for a usable spot. It is approached as a directed line with known entry points, known tasks, and a bank arranged around repeated handling. Even the ground beside it reflects that order, with fewer wandering tracks and more fixed routes between water, worksite, and storage. At the controlled edge, the signs of constant attention remain in small details. Water enters the cut channel without spreading across the bank. A gateboard is shifted by hand, then settled back into place. The mill race keeps within its bounds, fast where it must be fast, and quieter where it returns toward the main course. Along the path, fresh scrape marks show where silt has been cleared and fallen earth cut away before it can narrow the channel. Stones at the margin sit unevenly where repairs have been made one at a time. A spare plank leans against the bank face, ready for the next adjustment, and damp footprints cross the hardened ground where someone has just checked the flow. This is not a riverbank left to recover its own form. It is a working edge that holds only through repeated adjustment, and from such managed reaches the Nile moves toward more heavily built frontage, where controlled water, fixed crossings, and permanent riverside structures gather into denser settlement along the bank. At a ferry landing, the Nile is narrowed into procedure. Stone steps descend from one bank to a flat place of beaten earth, where passengers wait with bundles, baskets, and tethered animals. A rope post stands near the waterline, worn smooth where the ferry is pulled in and held against the edge. The lower steps are dark from repeated wetting, and the mud beside them has been cut back so hooves and sandals can find firmer footing. On the far side, the bank rises differently. The landing there is cut more sharply, with a short wall of packed earth and a small shelter set back from the water where a clerk or guard can sit above the traffic. A pole carries a marker for dues or local orders. Nothing in the river itself marks a border, yet the crossing makes the change visible. People pause, loads are counted, and the ground beyond the steps belongs to a stretch managed by other hands. At such points the Nile could separate one district from the next, while also serving as the easiest route between them. A traveller moving along the bank might need permission, payment, or a ferryman's timing to pass from one side to the other. But the same water continued to carry boats, produce, and official messages across that divide. River travel reduced the effort of distance, even when local authority changed at the landing. A boundary on the bank did not stop movement. It concentrated it at the steps, the ferry, and the narrow place where people, cargo, and animals had to come down before they could continue. A landing with a tax bench, a waiting line, and a place to tie livestock could matter far more than an open stretch of bank many kilometers long. The river remained a corridor, but it was entered here through a selected point, and that point made regional difference practical at the water's edge. The difference between neighbouring regions did not need a large sign to be legible. On one bank, fields might run in tighter strips, held back from the water by a trimmed embankment that showed regular repair. Across the channel, cultivation could open in broader patches with a rougher margin where reeds and damp soil met the first worked ground. The treatment of the river edge said as much as any written order. One side showed cleared approaches and a landing kept ready for repeated use. The other kept a more irregular slope, usable but less formal, with boats drawn up where the bank happened to allow it. Settlement spacing changed the look of the river as well. A cluster of mud brick buildings close to the landing, with storage set above the flood mark, suggested one pattern of control and exchange. Farther opposite, houses might stand wider apart, with more ground given to animals, or temporary shelter for those waiting on the crossing. Even the goods in view could shift, from measured loads of sacks and jars on one side to smaller piles of fodder, firewood, or local produce on the other. The Nile passed between both arrangements without altering its course for either of them. That divide gave certain stopping places more weight than their size would suggest. A landing where regions met could become a market edge, a place where grain sacks were shifted, animals were turned, and small fees were paid before the next stage of travel. Boat crews learned where officials were likely to inspect cargo and where ferries could still work when the bank was soft from recent water. People who lived near these points were used to interruption. Traders waiting for a load to be checked, families holding back until space opened on the boat, messengers crossing with little more than a document case and a clear route to follow inland. The settlement beside the river did not need to be large. Repeated movement gave it purpose. The crossing fed the baker, the boatman, the rope maker, and the keeper of animals standing above the wet margin. A spare line hung under the shelter for the next pull, and a guide standing nearby knew which road beyond the landing remained passable after rain, and where a convoy should wait until the ferry returned. In this way, the river crossing supported a small working economy, built from delay, transfer, and the need to move safely from one jurisdiction to the next. Once the ferry pushes off, the river resumes its broader line, but the sense of division does not disappear at once. It continues in the changed handling of the banks, in the spacing of settlements, and in the different kinds of traffic gathering at the water. More built edges begin to replace softer margins. The signs of one region ending and another beginning are no longer confined to a single crossing place. Ahead, the Nile enters a stretch where those differences show more continuously along the shore, in a river edge that is more occupied, more regularly worked, and more clearly tied to the identity of the land beside it. At a built stretch of riverfront, the Nile meets the city at worked stone. Masonry steps descend to the water beside a quay where boats are held against iron rings set into the edge. Porters move between the landing and a street that rises only slightly from the bank before disappearing between close walls and shop fronts. The lower stones are dark from repeated wetting, while the upper courses are worn smooth by carts, sandals, and animals brought down to the river. Just beyond the landing, a bridge approach gathers traffic into a narrower line, so that waterborne and land movement meet at the same point. Nothing here suggests a city that simply spread until it touched the bank. The contact between river and street has been made usable, reinforced, and used so often that the edge itself now reads as part of the city. A larger city took hold at such places because the riverfront could be worked. Ground close to the water needed enough firmness, or enough height above the softest margin, to carry loading areas, storage, and roads that would not fail each time the river shifted. A crossing point nearby increased that value, since ferries or bridges drew movement from both banks toward the same approach. Reliable landing access mattered just as much. Where boats could come in repeatedly without sinking into an unstable slope, goods could be transferred with less delay and less loss. A bank that could be watched, held, and entered through known points also mattered, because dues, labour, and supervision all gathered where traffic came ashore. Cities grew where the Nile could be used as an edge of access rather than endured as a difficult margin. Behind that edge, the older city core often kept the pattern of river use long after later building covered it more densely. Streets leading inland from the quay tended to widen first where goods had to be sorted, stacked, or redirected, then narrow again where movement passed into a denser commercial fabric. Markets gathered close enough to the bank to receive produce, jars, timber, fodder, and finished goods without a second-long transfer. Storage buildings stood on firmer ground just above the reach of ordinary wetting, while administrative or commercial rooms occupied the more controlled approaches where arrivals could be observed. Even where later walls, houses, and workshops altered the original line, the city still showed how strongly its first organization depended on a usable riverfront. The approach roads, the crowded plots nearest the landing, and the alignment of older masonry all led back toward the same practical origin at the bank. That concentration changed daily movement along the river's edge. Embanked fronts and quays drew labour to certain stretches, while leaving other reaches less built and less busy. Boat crews aimed for the sections where stonework, steps, or retaining walls allowed a safer landing. Porters, animal handlers, and carters gathered where goods could be taken off quickly and moved at once into the street system behind the bank. A bridge intensified the pattern further. Traffic on foot, on animal back, and in wagons compressed toward the same approach, so that a short section of riverfront carried far more movement than a longer natural bank elsewhere. Work collected there as well. Ropes were repaired, cargo was watched, and small services appeared for anyone delayed between boat and street. Inns, sheds, and temporary stalls were most likely to stand where that constant transfer made a narrow frontage worth occupying. The urban river edge was therefore uneven. One section became dense with movement and supervision, while another, only a little farther along, remained a softer margin with fewer permanent works. In an older river-facing quarter, that dependence on the Nile can still be read in the built edge itself. Retaining walls hold a line that may once have been more irregular. Steps descend where the street still seeks the water, and bridge approaches preserve the old need to meet the channel at a controlled point. The stone at hand height is polished by generations of use, while lower courses show repair where current and wetting have worn at the joints. Even when later construction rises above it, the bank remains legible as the city's first working face. From here, the view can stay close to that face and turn to what gathered around it through ordinary use. Waiting, trading, local habits, and the daily life that settled most densely where water and city held each other in place. At a short flight of river steps, repetition has marked the bank more clearly than ornament ever could. The middle stones are worn into shallow hollows where bare feet and sandals have passed down toward the water over many seasons. A low platform of packed earth stands beside the top step, edged with broken pottery and smoothed in places where baskets and jars are set down in the same arrangement each year. Near it, a tree leans over the landing, its roots holding the upper bank, and a small niche built into the embankment carries soot stains and the remains of earlier offerings of oil or cloth. Below, the lowest step disappears when the river is high and returns when the water falls back. The place is not large, but it is prepared. The path to it is kept open, the edge cleared of reeds, and the worn line down to the water shows that people come here for known reasons. The acts repeated at such a bank are tied less to ceremony in the abstract than to conditions the Nile sets again and again. When the water has fallen enough for the lower fields to be reached safely, people come down with seed baskets, small tools, and jars to be filled before the day's work begins. Hands are washed, the rims of baskets are dampened. A few words may be spoken by an elder, a local attendant, or the oldest cultivator present, but the sequence stays close to the work itself. The river has given the ground back, and labour is about to begin on it. At another point in the year, when the current steadies and crossings become reliable again, the same steps receive a smaller gathering before boats push off with people, animals, or produce for the far bank. A brief blessing, a shared washing, or the placing of a lamp near the niche remains bound to that moment. It comes as the river changes what can be planted, crossed, carried, or resumed. The recurrence begins with the water level and is fixed afterward in local habit. Over time, that repetition attaches remembrance to very specific parts of the bank. A landing, a tree, a post, or a line of steps becomes known not because it is grand, but because the same actions are expected there again. Children are brought to the same upper platform where their parents once waited with jars. The first workable crossing after difficult water is remembered by the place where the boat touched the step, not by a date written elsewhere. A niche in the embankment, darkened by repeated lighting, keeps its place because people continue to pause before it at the same stage in the task. Even repairs follow the habit. If a step breaks, the new stone is laid to the old width. If reeds creep back over the path, they are cut so the gathering place remains recognizable when the season returns. Remembrance here stays tied to the physical edge of the Nile and to actions repeated there rather than to a broader story detached from the place itself. Those repeated observances shape nearby life in small but durable ways. Paths remain open because people need to reach the same bank at predictable times. Potters, basket makers, and sellers of oil, cloth, or simple food learn when a gathering will bring extra trade to a landing that is otherwise quiet. Boatmen know when more passengers will appear at a crossing linked to the return to the fields or to a local day of observance. Families arrive early enough to claim a dry place above the wet margin, and animals are tethered in the same cleared patches where the ground is firmest. The bank is maintained not only for transport, but for return. Steps are swept, loose stones pushed back into place, and the upper waiting ground kept usable because the custom depends on the site remaining legible. What survives at the river edge is not a large ceremonial complex, but a working place whose regular use preserves its form. After the gathering has passed, the bank does not return to neutrality. Damp footprints dry on the upper stones. A length of cloth remains tied near the niche. The path through the reeds is newly pressed, and the platform still holds the marks of baskets lifted only a short while before. Nothing large has to remain for the place to show what has happened there. Wear, arrangement, and expectation are enough. The Nile continues past the steps as before, but the bank now carries the signs of repeated communal action that have attached local life to this exact edge. From here, the documentary can move closer to individual lives and names, toward the people who became associated with particular reaches of the river, while the worn landing behind them still shows the older pattern of many hands returning to the same place. At the edge of a worked bank, a flight of narrow steps descends beside a stone-gauge shaft cut into the masonry. The water touches only the lower part now, but higher up the wall, measuring marks remain visible in worn bands and shallow incisions. Near the top landing, an inscription records a name no longer attached to a living face, only to this structure and to the watched rise and fall of the Nile beside it. The stair is enclosed enough to control access, yet open enough for the level to be read at close range. Mud has dried on the lower stones. The upper courses are smoother, where officials, attendants, and labourers once stood to compare the water against fixed marks. The object at the bank is plain, but deliberate. Someone wanted this river to be observed in the same place, against the same stone, under the same conditions each time. The people who worked in that manner left their mark through regular comparison. Scribes, measurers, surveyors, and local officials treated the Nile as something that had to be read accurately if others were to act on it. A water level noted too early or too late could change decisions about planting, storage, labour, or dues. Their work depended on fixed points: a marked wall, a stair, a post, a record bench above the wet margin. At such places, the river was turned into information. One season could be set beside another, a rise judged against earlier rises, and expectation adjusted before the fields were fully reached. Their names may survive only in short inscriptions, marginal notes, or office records, yet the river edge still shows the method they imposed on it. The Nile was not diminished by that work, but it was made more legible to those responsible for the land and traffic beside it. A second group left clearer physical changes. These were the builders, supervisors, and local authorities who did not only read the river, but tried to hold, direct, or regulate it at selected points. Their traces remain in trimmed embankments, stepped landings, side channels taken off at measured angles, gates set between masonry cheeks, and bank faces repaired where current had begun to cut too far into softer ground. Here, an official's name may remain on a block above a sluice. There, a bridge pier or retaining wall preserves the trace of someone who ordered labour, stone, and time to be gathered at the river's edge. A rough landing became a worked quay. A difficult crossing became a controlled approach. A stretch once left to shift from season to season was fixed more firmly into one line. The river continued to move, but now it moved against interventions that outlasted the lives of those who first planned them. The effects of that work were practical and close at hand. Better measurement could change when cultivators prepared lower ground, when officials expected produce to move, or how carefully a settlement watched the condition of its embanked edge. A gauge reading might shape decisions made well beyond the stair itself, but the first sign remained at the river wall where the mark was taken. Physical works changed movement just as directly. A repaired bank could support repeated unloading where mud had once delayed it. A controlled side channel could reduce damage at one landing while concentrating labour at another. Boatmen adjusted to fixed approaches, porters carried loads over firmer surfaces, and crossings became more dependable where masonry replaced a collapsing slope. None of this needs praise for the individuals behind it. The trace at the bank is enough. A stone mark, a cut channel, a retained edge, or a set of steps shows that particular hands and decisions reshaped the daily use of the Nile for many others. After those individuals pass from view, The river keeps only what can endure beside it. The inscription remains, though the office is gone. The measuring marks survive, though the readers have long since changed. A wall still holds where a supervisor once ordered its repair, and a side cut continues to guide water through a line, first chosen by someone whose name now matters less than the channel itself. At the bank, biography falls away faster than stone, record, or altered ground. What lasts is a readable trace. The place where water was compared, the edge where it was restrained, the structure where judgment became action. From here, the documentary can move beyond the single worker or official and stay with the longer record gathered around the Nile itself, in marks, notes, remembered levels, and the continued effort to understand the river through evidence left at its edge. At the edge of a shallow margin, the Nile changes character within a few steps. The near water lies over a soft bottom, where fine mud holds fallen stems, drifting plant fragments, and the pale roots of reeds entering from the bank. Just beyond that shelf, the colour darkens and the surface tightens where the depth increases and the current begins to pull more steadily downstream. Through the clearer strip near the edge, submerged stalks can still be seen leaning with the flow, while farther out they disappear into brown-green water that reflects only light and movement. A floating leaf may pause for a moment among the stems, then slip free and turn toward deeper water. From the bank, the change seems slight, but the shift from soft margin to stronger channel already separates different conditions within the same reach. Those conditions divide the water into distinct zones. In the faster middle current, fish cannot hold position without effort, and the open channel leaves little cover. Food passes through quickly there, but so does danger. Closer to the bank, where the flow slows over mud and roots, smaller movements become possible. Fish can turn more easily, feed among drifting matter, and use the uneven bottom to avoid the strongest pull. In a sheltered inlet, or behind a bend where the current loses force, suspended material settles more readily, and plant growth thickens, creating another kind of holding ground. The river does not offer one continuous habitat. Within one stretch, there is open water for movement, slower edge water for feeding, and quieter pockets where life remains less exposed. Even a small change in depth, or in the angle of a reed bed, alters how the water moves and what it can support. The most protected areas are not in the open current at all, but in flooded shallows and calmer sidewater connected to it. When water spreads into low reed beds or enters a backwater removed from the direct force of the channel, eggs and fry have a better chance of staying in place. The bottom there is warmer, softer, and often richer in plant cover than the main river. Stems break the flow. Mud holds organic matter. Small forms of life gather in the sheltered water and create feeding ground for what is still too small to enter the stronger current safely. A quiet side channel can serve the same purpose if it keeps enough depth while remaining protected from the river's full speed. These areas do not have to be large. A fringe of flooded reeds, a shallow pocket behind a raised bank, or a narrow backwater with only slight exchange can serve as nursery ground so long as the water remains long enough and the current does not strip it bare. The Nile protects life here through uneven, temporary, and very local shelter. People working from the bank learn these differences closely, even if they do not describe them in technical terms. Nets are not set at random. A trap is more likely to be placed where slower margin water meets a path of movement from deeper current, or where fish leave a sheltered side area to feed along the edge. Fishing from an exposed bank can be poor when the channel runs too hard, while a short distance away, near reeds or a quieter cut, the same water level may produce a better catch. Local knowledge forms around these small changes. A productive stretch in one season may be less useful when the river falls and the nursery water retreats, or when the current cuts too sharply against the bank and removes the cover fish had used before. The visible bank gives only part of the information. Beneath it, depth, softness of bottom, plant cover, and water speed determine where effort is worth placing. The underwater structure of the Nile shapes practical work above the surface, as clearly as any path, landing, or embankment. Yet from above, very little of that fuller arrangement can be seen at once. The surface shows only slight ripples where the stronger channel passes, a darker strip where depth begins, and the slow bending of reeds where sheltered water still holds among the stems. A patch of floating matter circles briefly in the calmer edge before breaking away. The river keeps most of its internal structure below sight, revealing it only through small signs at the surface and along the bank. That is enough here. The Nile is already nearing stretches where its visible form broadens and simplifies, even while the water still carries layered life beneath it. The view can now rise back from the shallows and the rooted margin to the broader river surface, following the channel onward toward its final open reaches. At one outer margin of the Nile, firm ground ends without a clean line. A narrow shelf of drier bank gives way to soft mud, marked by hoof prints, broken reed stems, and patches of standing water left between raised roots and flattened vegetation. Just beyond it, a belt of reeds closes part of the view, though a thin side channel can still be seen threading through the stems before rejoining the river farther down. Insects move in shifting clusters above the stiller water, and small birds use the edge between open channel and cover, stepping briefly onto exposed mud before disappearing back into the reeds. The main current remains close enough to register in the movement of floating debris and in the slight pull at the outer edge, but the margin itself is already divided into wetter, slower, and more sheltered ground than the bank first suggests. That edge is not a single riverside condition. The firmer open bank supports approach and brief stopping, but it dries more quickly and offers less cover. Immediately beyond it, the reed belt creates a denser strip, where stems break the wind and slow the water, giving smaller animals and insects a protected zone close to the main channel. Behind the reeds, a shallow backwater may hold longer than the open mud beside it, warming more quickly and collecting drifting matter that would pass through the river itself. Farther still, the floodplain margin remains wetter underfoot, even when it no longer looks like part of the river at first glance. Each of these zones is tied to the Nile, yet each works differently. Birds feed where mud and shallow water meet. Insects gather in the stiller air above the backwater. Small river-edge animals use the thicker growth and damp ground where the bank cannot easily be crossed in a straight line. What looks like one edge from a short distance away is already several neighbouring conditions set only a few steps apart. As the water level changes, those zones do not stay fixed. A sidearm that keeps a clear connection with the main channel in one period may become a quieter pocket when the level falls, leaving fish, insects, and birds to use it differently. A floodplain depression that appears separate in drier conditions can be drawn back into the river when water spreads outward again, reopening a route between standing water and the main flow. Even a shallow patch among reeds may shift from isolated cover to connected habitat once the water rises enough to pass over the low ground between them. Life at the margins depends on these temporary links. Movement does not happen only in the open channel. It also follows narrow side water, wet hollows, and low passages through vegetation that are usable only at certain levels. What appears from the bank to be a broken fringe of mud and stems is often a connected edge system that changes with the river's reach and retreat. That structure alters the visible use of the bank. Dense marginal growth limits where people can approach the water directly, so paths form only at the firmer openings, while longer stretches remain screened by reeds and wet ground. A bird may rise suddenly from cover at one of these blocked sections, because the margin there has been left undisturbed, while at a nearby opening the same bank shows repeated human access, trampled mud, and cut stems. Insect activity also concentrates unevenly, where standing water lingers behind the reed line. The air above it thickens more noticeably than over the exposed outer bank. The edge, therefore, changes from one short section to the next, not because the river has altered its course, but because the softer habitats beside it interrupt straight access and create pockets of cover, feeding ground, and damp shelter. The Nile's margin is shaped as much by what cannot be easily crossed as by the main water itself. Where the main channel runs past these softer edges, the contrast becomes clear. The river keeps a more definite line in midstream, carrying floating matter onward in steady movement, while beside it the margin spreads into side water, reed cover, and wet depressions that hold life close to the bank. The broader shape of the river is already beginning to assert itself, yet these fringe habitats remain active at its edge, receiving what the current leaves behind and sheltering what cannot remain in open flow. A few meters of water can separate exposed channel from dense marginal cover, but both still belong to the same reach. From here, the documentary can leave the broken bank, the side arms, and the wet ground behind, and move toward a wider downstream setting where the Nile opens further and the form of the river begins to change again. On an old map sheet, the Nile appears first as ink held between ruled margins. A bend in the channel is drawn with deliberate confidence, its banks edged by two dark lines that narrow and widen around a marked island before reaching a fortified town set back from the water. A crossing is indicated by a short note at the bank and a road approaching from drier ground inland. Farther down the page, the lower reach begins to divide, and the branches are given separate names as they spread across the sheet toward flatter country. The river has direction, labels, and a fixed outline. Faded wash and careful lettering make the page seem settled, yet the drawn Nile is already a chosen version of the real one, reduced to the features someone thought could be measured, trusted, or used. Older maps of the Nile do not show equal certainty from one stretch to the next. Some reaches are shaped with close attention to bends, islands, and adjoining settlements, as if the maker had access to repeated travel, survey notes, or official reports from that corridor. Elsewhere, the line becomes straighter, compressed, or oddly simplified. A marshy reach may be reduced to a narrow passage. A complex bank may be smoothed into a cleaner curve. Distances between known points can tighten or stretch according to what had been observed and what had only been inferred. The river on the page records uneven knowledge. It shows where crossings were regular enough to be noted, where administration required more exact location, and where a reach remained less settled in record because it had been less thoroughly travelled or measured. The map is not false for that reason. It is partial, and its confidence rises and falls with the kind of contact people had with the river at that time. Once drawn, the Nile could be used more deliberately. A mapped channel helped officials identify where a district met the bank, where a ferry or quay should be expected, and which settlements stood close enough to the navigable reach to matter in practice. Surveyors could compare a drawn bank with the ground before planning repairs, embankments, or new cuts. Boat traffic benefited when a useful channel, island passage, or crossing point had been fixed on paper rather than left entirely to local recollection. Taxation also depended in part on this kind of river line, because land beside a mapped branch or a recorded island could be attached more firmly to a jurisdiction, a storehouse route, or a known landing place. The map did not replace the river, but it made certain stretches easier to administer and compare. A bend with a named town and a marked approach road became more usable to distant officials than an equally real bend that remained only a local fact at the water's edge. That difference affected nearby life in quiet but durable ways. Channels that appeared clearly on a working map were more likely to receive official attention when quays needed repair, crossings had to be supervised, or a bank line was disputed. Settlements fixed repeatedly in record could become harder to ignore than places left as vague notes or omitted altogether. A landing drawn at the same point across successive copies gained a kind of administrative stability, even if the mud, traffic, and boat access there still changed with the season. Navigation followed the same pattern. Boatmen continued to rely on direct experience, but mapped islands, branching reaches, and established stopping points helped turn some parts of the Nile into better-known corridors than others. The page did not create the river traffic, yet it helped concentrate notice on certain banks, crossings, and towns. In that way, a line of ink could influence which places along the river were watched, repaired, counted, or approached as fixed points rather than shifting edges. And still the real Nile refused to remain fully still for the page. A bank drawn cleanly in one century might later have retreated or been strengthened with masonry. An island shown in mid-channel could shrink, divide, or disappear. A lower branch might be rendered broad and certain on one map, then narrower or differently placed on another as channels altered and newer surveys corrected the older line. The drawn river preserved an attempt to fix shape, but the physical river kept adjusting its margin, sediment, and course within that outline. Looking from map to water, the gap is often small enough to be useful and large enough to matter. The Nile could be measured, named, and redrawn, yet it always remained more changeable than its neatest representation. From here, the documentary can move beyond the ruled sheet itself, toward other ways the river was recorded and described, where the Nile appeared not only as a line to follow, but as a subject shaped by words, accounts, and other forms of observation. A boat waits just off a short flight of river steps, while a passenger on the bank looks toward the far side and does not yet board. The stern has been pulled against the landing with a rope looped around a worn stone post, and the hull moves only slightly as small waves strike the lower steps. Above the waterline, baskets and a rolled mat have been set down in a neat cluster, as if departure may come soon but not immediately. Reeds begin a little farther along the bank, where the worked landing gives way to softer ground, and behind the steps a narrow path rises toward houses built close enough to the river to hear traffic at the edge. This is the sort of place that could pass easily from life into writing. It is a real bank, with a real delay in movement, but also a scene in which the Nile becomes a place of waiting, decision, arrival, or leaving. Writers used the river in those practical ways because the Nile already governed how movement happened. A journey by water could carry a figure toward a city more directly than any inland road, so the river became a natural route of approach in story. A branch channel or ferry point could delay that same figure, turning the bank into a boundary between one part of an account and the next. A settlement first seen from the boat, a quay reached after slow travel, or a crossing missed because the water had risen too far, could all give shape to an account without departing far from the river's actual conditions. The Nile offered writers a line that joined places while keeping distance between them. It also supplied usable limits. A broad bank could separate one person from another. A crossing could become the point where news arrived, a message failed to arrive, or goods from elsewhere entered the scene. In such writing, the Nile often stayed close to the working river, using its boats, edges, delays, and approaches as the framework for events. In verse and more reflective writing, the river was handled somewhat differently, but the material remained physical. The annual rise, the visible width of the channel, and the cultivated strip beside the water gave writers a small set of recurring images that could be used again because they were so often seen. The broad bank could stand for abundance, not as a loose abstraction, but because green cultivation ended sharply where the river's influence ended. The returning water level could suggest reassurance or expectation, because it altered work on the ground in ways people near the Nile understood directly. Boats at rest below a town wall, reeds moving at the edge of stiller water, or a bank darkened by recent wetting all offered images stable enough to be recognized from one text to another. Even when the language grew more compressed or elevated, it still depended on conditions belonging to the actual river: fertility along the margin, distance across the water, and the need to wait for the Nile to permit movement or work. Repeated use of those scenes fixed certain parts of the Nile more firmly in shared imagination than others. The river approached by boat, the bank where one waits to cross, the city first seen from the water, and the cultivated edge rising above the floodplain became familiar written settings, because they matched places people knew or expected to know. A key or stair in a text could lend additional permanence to an actual type of river edge, making later readers or listeners more ready to see the Nile in those terms. The effect was not to replace the real bank, but to reinforce selected views of it. Some stretches became easier to imagine as points of arrival, separation, or abundance because writing had returned to those functions so often. A reader who had never seen the Nile could still picture a ferry delay, a walled river approach, or the first green fields above the wet margin. In that way, story and verse preserved practical scenes from the river by giving them a second life beyond the moment in which they were first observed. Yet, the actual bank remained more exact than any written version of it. The rope rubbed against the post. The lowest step stayed wet longer than the rest, and the waiting baskets had real weight in them, whether or not a text chose to mention such details. The Nile could be turned into setting, route, boundary, or image, but it did not cease to be mud, current, landing, and cultivated edge. Writing selected from the river. The river itself kept everything at once: traffic, silt, delay, labour, and the shifting line between worked ground and water. As the documentary moves forward, that written Nile can now be set beside the present one, where older ways of seeing the bank remain faintly recognisable, even as modern crossings, altered edges, and changed patterns of use have given the river another visible form. Along one Nile reach, the river can be read almost at a glance. A band of cultivation runs beside the water in a long green strip, while beyond it, the ground dries quickly and loses the same density of use. The bank is firm enough for paths, loading points, and small landings, but the worked ground does not spread far before the colour changes and the vegetation thins. Date palms, field edges, and low settlement all stay tied to the line of water with unusual discipline. From the bank, the river does not look buried inside a broad, wet landscape. It looks held within a corridor whose usable margins are clear. Boats move within that line. Fields depend on it. And the difference between river-fed ground and drier land beyond can be seen without any wide view. Set beside a river that runs through heavier rainfall and a broader wooded basin, the Nile becomes more distinct in form. On a river such as the Congo, water and thick vegetation can occupy a wider, less sharply bounded setting, so the corridor of use does not always appear as a narrow strip drawn cleanly against drier country. The Nile more often gives the opposite impression. Its bank, cultivation, settlement, and adjacent dry ground stand in closer visual contrast. Even where the river broadens, the usable band beside it can still feel concentrated rather than diffused through a wet valley. That difference can be read directly from the ground. On the Nile, the relation between channel and habitable margin is often immediate. A field begins because the river allows it. A settlement holds because the bank remains workable. The transition from water to less productive ground may happen over a short distance, making the river corridor itself unusually legible. Its behaviour has also long set it apart from rivers governed more directly by local rain or by many strong tributaries entering from several directions. Compared with a river such as the Tigris, whose level could respond more abruptly to rain and upland runoff, the Nile's historically important annual rise encouraged a different kind of attention. People watched for the returning change in level, compared one season with another, and treated the river as something that could be measured and anticipated with practical care. Its long, continuous line also gave it a particular use as a route. While many great rivers carry traffic, the Nile offered long stretches in which movement, settlement, and water knowledge were tied again and again to the same channel rather than dispersed through a wide branching network. That did not make it simple. Cataracts, shifting banks, and local difficulties remained, but the seasonal pattern and strong linear form supported a habit of watching, recording, and managing water that feels especially characteristic at the Nile's edge. Those differences shaped life along the banks. Where the river corridor is narrow and strongly defined, cultivation tends to gather close to the water instead of spreading broadly across a wetter valley floor. Settlements do the same. Important stopping points, crossings, and urban concentrations become easier to understand because the strip of dependable use is itself more limited and more continuous. On a river with a broader flood basin or a more dispersed tributary landscape, movement and settlement may spread across a wider watery region. Along much of the Nile, by contrast, the line of traffic remains easier to concentrate. Boats, landing places, embanked edges, and roads approaching from inland all converge on a river that is visually and practically central to the occupied ground beside it. The result is not merely a different scene. It is a different arrangement of labour, storage, cultivation, and settlement at the edge, with less room for the river to fade into a generally wet landscape and more pressure for life to organise itself around one dominant channel. Once those comparisons are set aside, the Nile stands more clearly on its own bank again. The cultivated strip, the dry ground beyond it, the settled edge, and the long line of usable water no longer need another river beside them to be understood. Comparison has only sharpened what was already visible in the scene: a corridor with a direct relation between water and life, and a river whose seasonal behaviour demanded regular attention rather than casual reliance. From here, the documentary can leave other rivers behind and return fully to the Nile in its later condition, where that same distinctive character persists even as modern works, altered banks, and present-day demands have changed how the river is used, measured, and seen. At a present-day Nile reach, several uses meet within a few meters of the water. A retaining wall holds the bank in a straight line, and below it, a short managed landing descends by concrete steps to a level where small boats can still be tied. Just above the wall, a narrow road carries motorcycles, carts, and service vehicles past cultivated ground that begins almost immediately behind the built edge. Green strips of crops run beside the river, broken by pump pipes, fenced plots, and the entrances to riverside buildings set close enough to look directly over the water. A few boats lie moored against the bank, not as ornament, but as working craft, their hulls marked by repeated contact with the wall. The river remains broad and mobile, yet the edge now reads as something organised, reinforced, and used in routine ways along the corridor. That regularity depends on structures that make the bank more manageable than in earlier stretches. Pump intakes project toward the water where irrigation still begins with the river itself, even when the lifting is now done by engine rather than by hand. Water leaves the main channel through controlled openings, enters smaller canals, and is distributed across adjacent fields by a system that relies on fixed levels, embanked lines, and road access for maintenance. In some places, the bank has been cut into a serviceable slope rather than left as mud. In others, it is faced in masonry or concrete so that erosion, loading, and seasonal change can be kept within narrower limits. Flood control works, culverts, and reinforced corners around bridge approaches show the same intention. The Nile is still expected to support farming, transport, and settlement directly, but more often through planned edges, predictable access points, and banks that are less free to shift. The pressure of present-day use is visible just behind and directly on top of that controlled edge. Apartment blocks, workshops, storage yards, and small cafes now stand close to the water in stretches where older river ground might once have been more open. Ferries continue to move people across at selected points, while service craft, fishing boats, and barges use the same margin in tighter space than before. At one landing, a truck backs down near the wall to unload sacks or crates. A little farther along, people sit by the railings in the evening or cast lines into the slower water beside moored hulls. These uses do not occupy separate districts. They overlap within one compressed riverfront, where cultivation, transport, commerce, and brief recreation all depend on the same bank remaining accessible. It is not a clean modern frontage, but a layered working edge where older reliance on the Nile continues inside newer forms of building and traffic. That pressure changes the character of the margin itself. The bank becomes harder underfoot and visually more continuous, with fewer places where reeds, shallow mud, or open flood ground can spread without interruption. Older habits of approaching the river at many informal points are reduced when walls, fences, or private frontages leave access only at steps, ramps, and managed landings. Fishing still continues, but often from defined openings rather than from a long soft edge. Small boats can still be pulled in, though only where a gap in the embankment, a stair, or a sloped cut has been preserved for them. The same change affects nearby life above the waterline. Traffic gathers at bridge approaches and ferry points. Maintenance crews need room to reach pumps and walls, and farming must work around roads, utility lines, and bank treatment that now compete for the same narrow strip of land. The river remains central, but more of its margin is claimed, directed, and partitioned than before. In a smaller detail, that shift is easy to see. Water moves past a concrete edge, darkened at the lower courses, then curls briefly around the stern of a tied boat beneath a bridge, where cables, railings, and a pump line converge above it. A few meters away, a set of steps still gives direct contact with the Nile, and a farmer waits beside containers to fill them before returning to nearby plots. Nothing in the scene stands apart from the rest. Reinforcement, access, irrigation, traffic, and daily reliance all meet in one narrow riverfront, where older dependence has not disappeared, but has been absorbed into a more controlled and crowded form. From here, the view can stay with that pressured edge and move toward the work now required to keep it usable. The bank repairs, the defended corners, and the few places deliberately left open where the river can still be reached. At one repaired reach of the Nile, the recent work is visible in the shape of the ground itself. A bank that had been steep and cut away has been drawn back into a longer slope of fresh soil, with rows of young reeds and other bank plants set into the damp surface at measured intervals. Near the waterline, a band of stone has been laid at the toe to hold the lower edge where the current still presses hardest. But above it, the bank no longer rises as a hard wall. Shallow water now spreads a little farther across the margin before meeting firmer ground. A narrow side inlet, once blocked by silt and debris, has been opened again so that slower water can enter and leave without tearing at the main edge. The whole stretch looks worked, but not simply hardened. The repair can be read in cut earth, planted stems, the reopened side water, and the changed angle at which the Nile now meets the land. At such a place, the first concern is loss of ground. A bank that erodes too quickly threatens paths, nearby fields, utility lines, and the built edge above it. So, the work begins by holding the soil without forcing the river into a fully rigid face. Pulling a vertical edge down into a gentler slope reduces the force of water at one point and spreads it across a broader surface. Reopening a side margin gives part of that force another route, especially when levels rise and the main channel presses harder against the bank. In some places, a narrow strip is left between the river and the nearest road or cultivated plot, so that seasonal movement can be absorbed within limits instead of cutting directly into the edge above. The bank is not returned to a completely open margin. It is adjusted so that the river does less damage, while the ground beside it behaves a little more like riverbank again. Once that shape is in place, the margin begins to function differently. Slower water along the new edge lets fine sediment settle where it would once have been swept away from a hard face. Moisture remains longer in the planted strip above the waterline, and the roots of reeds or other bank growth begin to bind the upper soil where bare ground would have cracked and slumped. The reopened side area, even if shallow and narrow, can hold quieter water than the main channel and keep it a little longer after the level falls. The result is a less uniform edge, a wetter lower strip, a planted middle band, and firmer ground above. Small plant growth returns first, followed by insects and birds using the cover and damp soil, But the physical change comes before the livelier one. The repaired bank does not become wild. It becomes layered, with depth, water speed, and surface condition no longer pressed into one hard and even line. That alters nearby use as well. Access is often redirected so that people no longer step down across the whole bank wherever the shortest path happens to be. A fence, a marked path, or a single landing point may guide movement to the places that can bear it, while the softened stretch is left to hold soil and water rather than constant foot traffic. Farmers may give up a narrow strip at the immediate edge in exchange for a bank that fails less often and keeps its form better through the season. Maintenance crews still reach the river, but they do so along set routes instead of across a bare slope. The result is a shared margin rather than a fully open working face. Part of the bank still serves roads, fields, pumps, and nearby settlement, yet part of it is now expected to slow water, trap sediment, and remain planted. The river edge is doing more than one job at once, and that changes how people stand beside it, cross it, and maintain it. In a smaller view, the compromise is plain. Water moves past the stone footing, then drifts into the reopened inlet, where young reeds lean over a shallower strip of brown-green water below a path that still runs along the embankment above. The older control has not disappeared. The road remains, the upper bank is still held in line, and the landing farther along is still cut for direct access. But between those harder points, the Nile now meets a margin that has been given back some depth, softness, and cover. Repair has not removed negotiation from the river. It has put that negotiation into the ground itself. From here, the documentary can move toward the question that follows naturally from such sites. Not whether the Nile will remain used, but what kind of living edge people are prepared to protect, tolerate, and keep beside that use. At a present-day working reach, the Nile sits at a level the bank was not fully shaped for. Concrete steps descend toward the water, but the lowest flights are dry and streaked with old wet marks far above the current line. A mooring rope drops at an awkward angle from a bollard set for deeper water, and the boat tied there now rests beside a strip of exposed mud rather than directly against the landing. A pump intake extends farther into the channel than usual, its pipe supported by temporary bracing where the river has fallen back from the edge it was expected to meet. Fresh silt lies in the quieter corner below the wall. The bank is still usable, but only through adjustment. The visible water level and the built riverfront no longer sit in easy agreement. The same stretch is tested differently when the Nile rises and when it falls. High water presses against joints, steps, and retaining walls that seem stable in ordinary conditions, softening the ground behind weaker sections and drawing attention to places where seepage begins or the edge starts to slump. Low water exposes another set of problems. Landing points end above mud instead of above navigable depth. Intake pipes reach less reliably toward flowing water, and quieter side margins begin to silt up where the channel no longer clears them. A bank shaped for one range of levels is strained at both ends. When the river stands too high, force concentrates against the worked edge. When it stands too low, that same edge lies too far from the water it was built to serve. In both conditions, the usable range narrows. Because of that, the river here is managed repeatedly, rather than simply left to hold its form. Mud is cleared from shallow approaches when boats can no longer come in cleanly. Pumps are lowered, extended, or reset when the intake line no longer reaches dependable depth. Weak sections of bank receive new stone, fresh fill, or temporary facing after difficult water has cut into them. Debris caught against bridge footings or landing stairs is removed before it turns the current into softer ground. Where a side channel has begun to close with silt, crews reopen enough of it to keep slower water moving and to prevent stagnation against the main edge. A landing may be shifted a short distance to find more workable depth, then shifted back again when levels recover. None of this gives the bank a final form. Maintenance is part of the structure itself. The Nile at this edge is held together by repeated clearing, shoring, moving, and patching, often in small increments visible only as recent work in the ground and masonry. Those adjustments alter everyday use of the river. Ferries may load from a different angle when the usual landing is left too high above the water or too close to soft mud. Farmers waiting to draw water find that pumps need more time, longer hoses, or temporary platforms before irrigation can resume at the expected rate. Paths that run close to the edge can become unusable after high water has softened the bank, even if the road a little farther back remains intact. Fishing from the landing changes as well, because deeper water no longer lies where it usually does, and boats must be tied where access is less convenient. Shop deliveries, short crossings, and routine loading all become more hesitant when the bank cannot be used in its ordinary way. Dependence on the Nile continues, but under more temporary terms. What looks from a distance like a permanent bank is, in practice, a working margin that must keep being fitted again to the river. After the latest adjustment, the signs remain in a single small section of the bank. Fresh stone has been placed below a repaired corner. A darker watermark runs across the wall above the current surface, while below it, exposed mud lies under the lowest step where the landing should meet open water more directly. The mooring line has been retied to a lower ring, and a patched intake support leans farther out into the channel than the original installation intended. Nothing here suggests collapse, but nothing suggests completion either. The Nile passes the repaired edge at its own level and pace, leaving the bank marked by recent response rather than stable balance. From here, the documentary can move toward its closing ground, with that same condition still in view. The river remains usable, but only through continued negotiation with a waterline that does not stay where the built edge would prefer it. In a lower reach of the Nile, the river no longer keeps to one firm line between clearly opposed banks. The water spreads wider, then divides, with one channel holding straight ahead, while another slips away at a softer angle through lower ground. Between them lies land that does not rise sharply from the water, but extends in flat strips of damp soil, reeds, and worked embankment. The edges are less abrupt than before. A bank that might once have been read easily from step to step now gives way to shallower margins, side water, and stretches where the river seems to pause before taking a clearer line. Boats do not approach a single dominant edge in quite the same way. The landscape has opened out, and the Nile is visible not only as a channel, but as a broader arrangement of water, mud, and low ground separating into more than one course. That change in form comes with a change in behaviour. The water here does not cut the bank with the same steady force seen farther upstream. Its movement is slower and often less decisive at the margins, where fine sediment settles more readily into quiet strips of shallowing water. Mud banks build outward in modest tongues. Reeds take hold where the current no longer strips the edge bare. A floating branch or clump of plant matter may drift farther before being drawn into a clear line of movement, because the pull is weaker and more divided. Near the side margins, the water darkens less suddenly into depth. Instead, it lingers over softer bottoms and shallower ledges where silt has begun to collect. The river still moves with volume, but more of what it carries now drops out along the edges and in the slower stretches between the stronger lines of flow. As the current divides, the ground between channels becomes part of the river's structure, rather than merely land beside it. A secondary branch may hold enough depth to carry regular movement, yet remain calmer than the main line. A narrower cut, partly managed and partly natural in its shape, may serve as a local route or drainage path, while also distributing water through the low terrain. Between these branches, intermediate ground appears in long, flat sections that are partly embanked, partly cultivated, and partly left to reeds, wet soil, or shallow standing water. The Nile no longer behaves like a single inland corridor fixed by one bank on either side. Water passes through several routes at once, and the land shows that division clearly. One edge may be trimmed and held for use, while another, only a short distance away, remains soft and silting. The result is not confusion, but a broader and more layered river form in which channel, sidewater, and low ground all belong to the same settling system. That altered structure changes nearby use of the land. Fields and settlements no longer gather only along one dominant bank, but are distributed through a network of embanked plots, crossings, drainage lines, and canal links that depend on more than one branch. Movement also becomes less singular. A road may approach one channel, while a ferry or small bridge serves another a short distance away. Bank management follows the same pattern. Instead of one continuous edge to reinforce and maintain, there are several working margins. Some hardened, some cut back, some left lower because the water there arrives more gently. Farming benefits from the fine sediment and the accessible water, but it also requires closer control of the ground between channels and more attention to the places where slow water gathers. The river does not disappear into land here. It spreads into a more connected system, and the practical life around it adjusts by treating water, embankment, and settlement as parts of one broad deltaic edge rather than one simple bank line. In one smaller branch, the approach to open water is already visible in the character of the margin. The current moves with less urgency, carrying fine brown sediment past reeds rooted in a low mud bank below a worked edge of stone and earth. A side channel widens into quieter water, where the surface no longer breaks around every obstruction, and the bank beyond lies so low that it seems ready to give way to broader coastal ground. The river is still recognizably a river here, with directed flow, managed edges, and fresh water moving between settled banks. But its pace has softened, its sediment has begun to settle, and its channels no longer insist on a single path. From here, the documentary can follow that slower branch onward, toward the point where the Nile's divided water reaches its final transition and the river gives itself over to the sea. At the Nile's final approach, the water no longer holds to one inland channel with the same firmness as before. Low embanked ground lies between slower branches, and the margins soften into reeds, mud, and shallow water, where fine sediment settles along the edge. The current still carries the river forward, but with less force than upstream, and the banks no longer rise as one clear corridor. A worked margin of stone or packed earth may still hold one branch in line for a short distance. Yet nearby the water spreads into quieter side reaches where the surface broadens and the depth becomes less certain. The river is still present as directed flow, but it already shares its last landscape with low ground, deposited silt, and the first signs of coastal water. That water belongs to the same connected system that began far inland in much smaller conditions. Here, in the lower reaches, the branch is wide and slow, but it remains continuous with upper waters that first held close to wet ground, reeds, stones, and narrow channels that gave little sign of the scale to come. The same movement that now slackens among silted margins once ran past marsh edges, firmer banks, cultivated strips, and cut landings much farther south. Nothing at the mouth needs to announce that continuity. It remains in the water itself, which has kept one long connection, while its banks, depth, speed, and uses changed again and again along the way. A few visible changes are enough to show that development without turning it into a tally. The river that began in wet margins became, in many stretches, a more strongly worked corridor, with cultivated ground pressed close to the bank and movement gathered at crossings and landings. Elsewhere, the edge was cut, measured, embanked, or divided into side channels and held approaches. Farther on, denser settlement, pumps, roads, and reinforced walls brought a different pressure to the same water. Even recent repair work, with softened slopes, planted margins, and controlled access, belongs to that same sequence of adjustment. The Nile did not keep one fixed form of river ground. It passed through narrower banks, busier edges, and more managed reaches before arriving here, where the current slows and the channel spreads again. Its character lay in that accumulation, rather than in any single reach. Upper marsh and shallow bank, cultivated edge above damp soil, ferry landing cut into workable ground, city wall facing a quay, measured steps beside a watched waterline, repaired slope below a path, and these final low branches entering coastal terrain all belong to one river system. Each condition altered what people could plant, cross, build, unload, watch, or defend. But the physical continuity remained. The Nile was never only one kind of river. Its form emerged through repeated changes in edge, movement, and use, all carried within the same connected flow. Now the ending landscape takes precedence again. The lower branches move with reduced urgency through ground that is flatter, softer, and more divided than the river corridor farther inland. Reeds hold at the margins where the current no longer tears them free. Mudbanks gather below low-worked edges. Fine sediment settles in quieter water beside embankments and among shallow side reaches. Fields, roads, and settlements remain present, but they no longer stand along one commanding channel in quite the same way. Water passes through several low routes at once, and the difference between river margin and coastal ground grows less definite with each slower reach. In one last branch, the Nile enters open water by degrees rather than by a single abrupt line. Brown-green river water moves past a final worked edge, then slackens beside reeds and a low mud bank where fresh sediment is already spreading into the shallows. The channel widens, its outline becomes less exact, and the surface ahead belongs less to a contained river than to a broader coastal reach receiving it. The bank remains for a short distance, then gives way to lower ground and water without a firm inner boundary. Here the Nile ends as a visible change in form, a river branch losing the last certainty of channel as it enters the sea.